also reported to masters that he fondled his sister as well as his older brother, kind of in his confusion to understand his sexuality. So we're already finding that Nilsen doesn't. He has fantasies that are very different from what a normal child would have, as far as wanting to kill animals and having an inclination to molest his siblings. At 15, he decided to join the army to get away from the small town that he lived in and possibly to explore the world. He joined a section of the army that contracted him as a chef for 9 years. He then went off to training camp, and the army life kind of took him from being a scrawny teenager to a strong, athletic man. It also brought him a lot of confidence, and he became very physically fit. At the age of 18, he finished his recruitment course shared a love of film. When Nilsen was in Germany, he bought an 8mm camera, and the two of them actually filmed like several short films together to kind of pass the time in the army. Dennis ended up being infatuated with him, while Terry, thought that it was just a pure resigned because the police force was very homophobic, and Dennis had started to be more open about his sexuality, and it wasn't taken well. So he decided to leave the police force and became a security guard for the Department of Environment. During a security patrol in the warehouse at the Natural History Museum, most of his prowling and most of his killing. He was tall and slim with dark, tinted, crooked teeth. He was clean shaven and he had short dark hair. He often wore dark trousers and a tweed jacket, so he didn't look scrubby or shabby or anything like that. And he would usually wear rimless eyeglasses. One night, he decided to go out to the pub, as he often did, and he was outside when he saw a skinny, blonde young man between the ages of 18 and 20 being bullied by some of the men outside of the pub. And we know that Nilsen likes to kind of be the hero, so he intervened and started to talk to this young man, who was also coincidentally named David, and found out that David lived in a local hostel. Nilsen invited him back to his flat to hang out, and David agreed. And this actually marked the beginning of a long-term relationship for Dennis. This was his first and only long-term relationship. Dennis's father had died that year in 1975 and had left some money to Dennis. So Dennis used that money to move into a ground floor flat at 195 Melrose Place. Dennis spent the remainder of the money on new furniture and convinced the landlord to allow Dennis and David to use the garden for their own personal use, to block off the entrance for any other tenants, and to only allow them to use it. And the landlord agreed. So they made like a beautiful garden in the back. They put in a nice like fish pond. They had vegetables growing back there. They had a bird, and David wanted a puppy. Nilsen was reluctant at first, but David insisted. So they ended up getting a puppy, and they named her Bleep, which is really cute. But let's remember, he's a psychopathic serial killer with a dog named Bleep. They also adopted a kitten, and they named her Dee Dee. Nilsen was really content in his new life, and he stopped frequenting pubs as much. But that kind of domestic side of him didn't last very long, and they started to have problems in their relationship pretty quickly. Dennis described David as being mousy and passive with his emotions, and Dennis was quite domineering and abusive. He would often call David names. He would make fun of his appearance. He would call him too skinny or too hairy, and was just belittling him. They were also very rarely intimate, and David was frequently unfaithful. He was a lot younger than Dennis also. He's like almost a decade younger. 4 months into their relationship, they basically stopped speaking, but they still lived together. And eventually they started bringing men into the flat, other men. In May 1977, there was an incident that pushed their relationship over the edge. So Bleep had a litter of is when Nilsen started going to the pubs again and bringing strangers back to his home. And this is, in my opinion, when things started to kind of really, like, fall off and get bad. Just kind of one example of some evidence for Nilsen's behavior becoming even more disturbing. So he was inviting a lot tried to be intimate with Stephen's body, but he realized that he wouldn't be able to do it. So he put his corpse on the floor and just went to bed. The next morning he woke up as if nothing had happened and tried to hide the body in the crawl space under the floor. But at this point, rigor mortis had set in, and it was very difficult for him to manipulate the body. So he waited another day and then was able to hide him there. After 1 week, he was curious about the decomposition of the body, and he took him out of the floor. He bathed the body, and then he bathed himself in the bath water, and became aroused during this time. He had planned to cut the body up and dispose of it, but couldn't bring himself to do it. He felt that the body was too pristine and pure to butcher it. And he kind of felt like he had a new roommate. It felt like there was someone there with him to keep him company. So he put his body back underneath the floorboards. In August of that same year, about 7 months after the murder, Nilsen decided to finally dispose of Stephen's remains. He started a bonfire in the back garden. He wrapped Stephen's remains in a plastic bag and placed him in the fire, and then he threw a tire in the fire as well to cover the smell. When his body was gone, he felt an immense sense of relief and started to drink heavily again and go back out to the bars. Now we're in October of 1979, and Dennis was at an arcade when he met Andrew Ho, a young Chinese student. They went back to his flat, and you'll see with these cases that there is a distinct pattern of being at a pub, going back to the apartment, drinking heavily, and then some kind of struggle ensues. So Andrew suggested that they go back to the flat and have sex and participate in BDSM. But Nilsen said he didn't want to, and instead he offered him money just to spend time with him. Andrew said that he wasn't really interested in that. He was only interested in some kind of intimate relationship with Nilsen. So he agreed, and they participated in bondage, and Andrew was tied up, and Nilsen started to strangle him. just to give you like a little bit of context into Nilsen's victims in the 1980s and 1990s in London, there was a large homeless problem, especially among young men, and also an unemployment problem, which got these two issues really fed into each other. And you see that in order to get a job, you have to list a place of residency, but in order to get residency, you have to have a job. So it was kind of an endless cycle. So you found that a lot of young men and teenagers ended up in the rent boy trade, which was kind of like selling yourself for rent with sexual acts. And Nilsen would see a lot of these vulnerable young men at his job because of the nature of his job, which was to place people in the restaurant industry, which kind of attracted young men who didn't really have a clear path, maybe had drug problems or had been to prison or were orphans or things along those lines. So in May of 1980, Nilsen met Martin Duffy, who was a 16-year-old catering student. He had just arrived in London. He was kind of a troubled young man. He left school at the age of 15, started stealing and getting in trouble, so his parents sent him away to a school for maladjusted adolescents, and there he received psychological treatment. When he was discharged, his parents divorced, and this seemed to have like a really big effect on him. So he started to party a lot, and he frequented a lot of clubs and became addicted to Valium, like a barbiturate. When he was on an upswing, like when things were looking up for him, one of his counselors helped him get into a catering school, and he graduated. He was successful, and he actually got a set of really nice knives for graduating. In 1980, he moved to London and did not tell his family, and that's where he met Nilsen. Nilsen ended up inviting him back to his flat, and the same pattern emerged. became sick several times as he was doing this, and he boiled their skulls and put their organs in plastic bags and buried them in the backyard. He stuffed other body parts in suitcases, and he put the suitcases in the shed in the backyard. Remember, the backyard is only being used by him at this point. He put some bars of deodorant over the suitcases to try to mask the smell, and covered them with bricks and newspapers. And over the following months, he met several men and brought them back to his flat. He told Masters that he remembers killing a homeless man, an Irishman, a long-haired hippie, and a Filipino man, but he doesn't remember all the detail. In November 1980, Nilsen was drinking at a local gay bar, and he met a man named Douglas Stewart. Nilsen ended up inviting a group back to his place, but Douglas was the only one who accepted, and he only accepted because he was trying to be polite. That really resonated with me because I'm a people pleaser, and I tend to get myself in situations that I don't want to be in just because I want to be polite. But follow your gut, people. If you feel like you don't want to go to a stranger's home, don't do it. I'm not saying that I've, been in a similar situation, but I'm just saying, follow your gut. They both drank, and Nilsen invited Douglas to his bed, but Douglas denied and fell asleep in an armchair. Douglas awoke to Nilsen on top of him, trying to strangle him, and there was a struggle. Douglas ended up on top of Nilsen on the floor, and Nilsen started yelling, I'm sorry, take my money, which is a little weird, but I think he was trying to do that just in case his neighbors heard, so they would think that Nilsen was trying to be robbed. For some reason, Douglas started apologizing to Nilsen, and then stayed for another drink, but I understand why he did this. He was probably trying to placate Nilsen, trying to calm him down, trying to reassure him that, oh, nothing's wrong, I'm just gonna have another drink with you, and then I'm gonna head out. So he left, and then called the police when he had the chance. Shortly after, a police officer showed up, and Nilsen explained that it was just a lover's quarrel. And the next day, the police tried to contact Douglas, but they were unable to, so the case was dropped. That's another complaint against Nilsen, and no investigation. By December 1980, he had the remains of 7 was an orphan and spent the majority of his youth in foster homes. He had a very low IQ and he was epileptic. He often slept in hostels or with men that he went home with, and sometimes would turn to sex work for income. Nilsen brought him back to his flat in like a small flash of humanity, like felt bad for this young man, and he made him some coffee, and he called an ambulance for him because the man was obviously in some kind of epileptic episode or was having some medical issues. Unfortunately, a couple days later, Malcolm had made his way back to Nilsen's flat, and Nilsen found him sitting on the steps. They hung out and watched TV. Nilsen wasn't going to give Malcolm anything to drink because of his condition, but Malcolm insisted, so he had a drink and then fell asleep. Nilsen tried to wake him up, but there was no response, and this time he was afraid to call the ambulance because he thought the police would become involved. So he didn't call the ambulance, and he ended up strangling him instead. And he hid him under the sink when he left for work the next day. Soon after this, the landlord offered to give him £1,000 to move out of the flat into another flat reflection, and he had the same marks on him. The mark around his neck, red eyes, and broken blood vessels in his face. Nilsen told him that he had been stuck in the zipper in the sleeping bag and that he had been splashing water on his face to try to wake him up. Carl saw a doctor, and the doctor told him the same thing about the strangulation, but Carl didn't report the incident either. 4 months later, September 1982, he met Graham Allen, who was a heroin addict who had moved from Scotland. He was a squatter and funded his drug addiction through theft and panhandling and welfare. He spent time in rehab and in prisons, and we aren't really sure how he ended up in Nilsen's apartment, but he was definitely on drugs, and Nilsen agreed to make him an omelet. Apparently he passed out while eating the omelet, and Nilsen decided to strangle him. And he kept his body in the tub for 3 days, changing the bathwater on occasion. On the 4th day, he did his whole routine of butchering him, boiling him down, and flushing him down the toilet. Graham was never reported missing because of his lifestyle. It was common for him to go missing. On New Year's Eve in 1982, I'm going to take a little sip. New Year's Eve, 1982. He went out to a pub around 11 and met a young Japanese chef named Tashumitsu Ozawa. They went back to his flat, and Nilsen tried to strangle him, but Ozawa kicked him in the crotch and was able to escape. He reported the assault to the police, but didn't follow up with charging him. Now the police have so many complaints about this one guy, and still they are doing nothing. 2 weeks later, he met Stephen Sinclair, who had kind of had a hard life like a lot of his other victims. He had been adopted. He was diagnosed with personality disorders at a young age. He self-harmed a lot. He was institutionalized at the age of 12, and by the time he was 18, he was addicted to amphetamines and had been to prison multiple times. Nilsen offered to buy him a meal from McDonald's, again, a small sliver of humanity in Nilsen. They ate and stopped to get some liquor. They went back to his apartment around 9 p.m. and they hung out. But eventually Stephen went to the bathroom to inject himself with some kind of drug. He ended up passing out in the armchair. Nilsen was held at Brixton Prison and was placed in the prison's hospital wing for his own safety. He was only allowed out of his cell to exercise for 30 minutes a day. He could not interact with other prisoners, and he was considered extremely dangerous. He started to write an autobiography called, I think it's called The Memoir of a Drowning Boy. The History of a Drowning Boy, sorry. He ended up writing 4,500 pages of this autobiography. It was 2 volumes, but it was never published because there was a huge, moral dispute about it. No one wants to glorify this man, and also no one can really trust what he says, so there are only 3 known copies. One is with his friend Mark, a second is with the cult writer P.P. Hartnett, and a third was to his solicitor. So, anyway, he also started his relationship with Brian Masters, the author, and this is from one of his early letters to Masters. I have led a strange life so far. Schoolboy, soldier, chef, projectionist, policeman, clerical officer, executive officer, drunk, sexualist, male and female, murderer, animal lover, independent trades union officer, debater, champion of social causes, do-gooder, dissector of murder victims, grand vizier, and probably lifer. If there is a God, he must have a weird and jumbled sense of priority. Job finder, peace campaigner, amateur filmmaker, mine of useless information, administrator, pen pusher, detained prisoner, killer of the innocent, unremorseful, reformed character, enigma, now rapidly becoming a national receptacle into which all the nation will urinate, warped monster, madman, ungodly, cold, and alone. May 26, 1983. The judge determined that the prosecution had enough evidence to try him for the murder of Stephen Sinclair, John Howlett, Billy Sutherland, Martin Duffy, Kenneth Ockenden, and Malcolm Barlow, and the attempted murders of Paul Nobbs and Douglas Stewart. The trial was scheduled for October, and during the trial, the defense claimed diminished responsibility due to a mental disorder in the hopes of reducing the charge to manslaughter. The jury was asked to decide not whether or not he was guilty, but whether he was of sound mind while he made the killings. 2 psychiatrists testified for the defense, saying that he was paranoid, unsure of his own identity, experienced feelings of grandiosity, that he was desperate for attention, had extreme fantasies, an obsession with nudity and unconsciousness, had extreme was transferred